Hello YouTube! So, the results of the 2020 PhilPapers survey have been officially released, and I thought I would do a video in which I express my views about them, because why not? That might be kind of fun. I'm going to react to the PhilPapers survey. This is my first reaction video, so yeah, maybe this is going to be a new thing for me, because this is what you all want, isn't it? I've seen the demographics of my channel, and you're all in your 20s, you're all the youth, and this is what the youth want. They want memes and react videos, so I'm doing a react video. Okay, so, well, you know, I don't have much to say about this first one. That's basically the same as it was in the previous survey, as I think is the question on abstract objects. I think that's very similar to the one on the previous survey. Actually, one thing I will say about this, which is kind of interesting, is that as we will see as we go through this, philosophers seem to be leaning in a realist direction in many contexts. So certainly when it comes to morality, there are a whole load of moral realists out there. And actually, even with aesthetic value, as you can see on this next question, it's about 50-50. So there's a lot of people who buy realism about aesthetic value. Now, realism about abstract objects, again, it's sort of split down the middle. But given the sort of realist inclinations that we see in other contexts, I am a little bit surprised that Platonism here is only on about 38%. Just because, it strikes me that the case for realism about, say, mathematical entities is actually much stronger than the case for moral realism. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first thing is that one of the main motivations for anti-realism is the thought that when we make moral claims, that seems to be connected to our sentiments, our passions, right? Like morality is something that moves us. It has that kind of motivational force to it, and it seems like it is appealing to emotional dispositions, and so that's something that obviously inspires non-cognitivist analysis of ethics. So that when somebody says abortion is wrong, well, really they're just expressing something more like abortion boo, right? That kind of view is founded on this idea that morality is a product of the passions, right? So we're not really even trying to describe mind-independent facts. We're expressing our values. And the point is that kind of approach seems totally implausible in the case of mathematics. I mean, when somebody says that, like, 1 + 1 = 2, to give a very simple example, but when people make mathematical claims, there doesn't really seem to be any plausible argument that they're just expressing their emotions or anything along those lines. So one of the main motivations that for moral anti-realism just doesn't apply in the case of mathematics. The other thing is that with mathematical entities, and I think actually quite a few other abstract objects, there's a very intuitive case for a sort of indispensability argument, appealing to the way in which these entities are quantified over in our best scientific theories. So science is saturated with mathematics, right? Our best theories of how the world works quantify over mathematical entities. And, I mean, it's like they say, that there is the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in science. So if you're attracted to scientific realism, if you think that scientific theories provide true descriptions of reality, and many philosophers do think that, then, you've got a pretty good case, at least a prima facie argument, that can similarly apply to mathematical entities, and that would support a Platonist view. So in the case of morality, yes, you can make that kind of argument. Like, there have been people who have argued that moral properties are similarly indispensable to our best theory of the world, but that's a lot more strained. Like, that's a much more difficult argument to make. The premise, the indispensability premise, is far less intuitively appealing in the case of moral properties than it is in the case of mathematical entities. So, given that there are so many philosophers who are attracted to like scientific realism, physicalism, naturalism, all that, again, there's at least prima facie plausible argument for the indispensability of mathematical entities that doesn't seem to apply to the case of morality. So for these reasons, you'd expect that, well, I mean, I think that the case for mathematical realism, the case for Platonism, is much stronger than the case for moral realism. But philosophers apparently, as a group, do not agree. Okay then, yeah, let's see if there's anything to say about these other... Oh yes, the aim of philosophy. Now this was quite an interesting one, because for this question you could select multiple options, and in light of that I'm actually a bit surprised that goodness justice is only on 22%. In fact, I mean, even like truth knowledge is only on 42%, and that's pretty low. Like, only 42% of philosophers think the aim of philosophy is truth/knowledge. You'd think it would be higher than that. I mean, I should say that my own view on this is I just don't think it makes sense to talk about the aim of philosophy at all, right? I think that we can attribute aims to particular individuals, we can attribute aims to sort of tightly knit research groups perhaps, but the idea that a whole field of inquiry is going to have an aim or some particular set of aims seems kind of absurd to me. But if you take seriously the notion of the aim of philosophy, you would think that there would be more than 22% of people selecting goodness justice. Well, I guess actually it's closer to 23%. But still, you'd think there'd be more than 23% of people selecting goodness/justice, because there are whole fields of philosophy, there are whole areas of philosophical inquiry that are plausibly interpreted as having that as an aim. Ethics and political philosophy seem to be directed towards that goal. At least if it makes sense to talk about any field of inquiry as having an aim, it surely makes sense to talk of ethics as having the aim of goodness/justice. So this was a little bit surprising. I mean, not surprising that most philosophers selected epistemic aims, like understanding truth/knowledge, but I would have thought that more would go for goodness/justice, especially given how many moral realists there are, as we will see. Yeah. So, eating animals. Now, this was another question that was not on the original survey. I think these are pretty much the results I would have expected. So, the case for veganism or vegetarianism is, from the point of view of most conventional moral frameworks, absolutely overwhelming. Like, it is pretty much a slam dunk case. Again, from most conventional moral frameworks. And philosophers are not perfect, but they are better than most people at following the arguments where they lead. On the other hand, they're not perfect, right? Like, they're not perfect, so it's not surprising that even so, there's still a majority favouring omnivorism. Actually, I think I selected omnivorism, but like, I don't adopt anything like a conventional moral framework, so of course. But yeah, I mean, give it another 10 years, it'll probably be like another 10% lower for omnivorism or something like that. The times are changing on this one. Actually, it'd be interesting to look at the differences in age group on that question, which you can do, but I'm not going to do right now. If I had planned this out more carefully, I would have already done that and would have that information, but I did not. So, okay, experience machine. This is another new question. Not surprising. I don't really have much to say about this one. So, yeah, I mean, obviously I would enter, but the footbridge question. This is very amusing. It's not surprising, because if you accept consequentialist approaches, then, I mean, certainly like on utilitarianism, then yep, it looks like pushing the guy off the footbridge is what you ought to do. But it's, I mean, again, assuming we are like just taking the thought experiment as it's intended, if you accept the hypothetical, then yeah, I mean, you got to push the guy off if you're a if you're a utilitarian or whatever, and there are a lot of utilitarians. So it's not surprising, but it is quite funny. It is quite funny that 22% of people are prepared to just bite the bullet on that particular question. Yeah. The gender question was an interesting one. I'm surprised that it got 30% of people selecting biological. So it seems to me, right, that as I understand it, the point of introducing the concept of gender as opposed to the concept of sex, right? So the point of drawing a distinction between sex and gender is precisely to have a concept that tracks certain, social norms, social roles, relationships, behaviors, and so on, as opposed to biological properties. So, there's different ways of kind of dividing up humanity. And one way we can divide them up is to look at things like chromosomes. And so we find the vast majority of people have XX or XY chromosomes. So that's one way of drawing this distinction between male and female. And then there's distinctions between the types of gametes that organisms produce, and there's distinctions in the reproductive organs that organisms are born with. And so there's these distinctions in terms of like what we might think of as purely biological properties. But then we find that these distinctions are correlated with certain types of behaviours and norms and so on. Right? When we look at human societies, that group of people that have the XX chromosomes and the large gametes and those other biological features, there are certain norms of behaviour associated with that, and that's the point of introducing the concept of gender. So I sort of feel like I don't know how it could be anything other than like psychological or social. It feels like if you're selecting biological, you're just missing the point. Or maybe you think that the sex-gender distinction is just not helpful. Maybe that's not a useful way of thinking about distinctions between groups of humans. But in that case, surely you'd just say that gender is unreal rather than that it's biological. So yeah, I found that a bit confusing, really. I mean, it seems, like I say, I don't actually know much about the literature on this topic, so maybe I just don't know what I'm talking about. But I would have thought it would be like I'm surprised so many people choose the biological option there. So yeah, I mean, maybe fewer atheists than I would have expected. I mean, it's still mostly atheists, but I'd probably predicted more like 75 to 80%. Look at this. Now, in the previous survey, I can tell you that relativism about knowledge claims had about, I think it was something like 2.5%. It was definitely, it's 2 point something percent, right, in the previous survey for relativism about knowledge. And now we are on 5.43%. So the relativists are making ground. In the previous survey, relativism about knowledge was my least popular position. The least popular option that I chose was my relativism. And actually, in this survey, it's not the least popular. So that's interesting. It's turned out that I have positions that are more unpopular than relativism about knowledge. But look at this. We have almost doubled our the proportion of philosophers who accept this position. So good news for the future. Hopefully in the next survey we will see relativism about knowledge on 10% or something. So something to look forward to for the future for relativism. Yeah. I'm surprised to see 32% of people accepting an objective meaning of life. I mean, this is what I was kind of hinting at when I said earlier that philosophers seem to be like more inclined towards realism, right? There's like loads of realists. Like, I just don't know how it makes sense to accept an objective meaning of life unless you are a traditional theist, unless you believe that there is some omnipotent, omniscient creator of the universe who has set out a plan for humanity, right? Like maybe in that sense, you can have a meaning of life, right? Like there's some purpose to your life. But like if you don't accept that, and obviously most philosophers are not theists, certainly not traditional theists, then I don't know, man. I just don't know, like, what sense does it make to talk of a meaning of life, right? That's not ultimately grounded in, the values of particular individuals. That's I mean, almost incomprehensible to me. To be fair, I have not read much of the meaning of life literature, so maybe that is why. But that's something I'll have to do, right? So I'll have to try to understand this. That's something for the future. But even so, man, that just seems totally nuts. Like, the very idea of like objective meanings and purposes, I think, is really ridiculous. I mean, there are I'm aware, attempts to kind of ground a notion of teleology in, like, natural selection, selected effect functions, things like that. I mean, I don't think that works, but even if that kind of thing does work, you're not going to get a meaning of life out of it, right? Like, you can get maybe teleology, you can get purpose with respect to particular biological properties or features, like, the heart. Maybe the heart has the purpose of pumping blood or something like that. But the idea is there's going to be a meaning of life. You're not going to get that out of that sort of Darwinian framework. And I'm not. I mean, where else is it going to? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this seems very strange to me. Okay. And here we are. The meta-ethics question. Look at that. 62% moral realists. 62% of philosophers accept moral realism. That is an embarrassment. That is an embarrassment. Look, right, I have to some degree a bit of a contrarian streak, right? I have contrarian inclinations, so I do enjoy it when my positions are unpopular, right? But the problem is, right, this is embarrassing, guys, okay? Okay, look, I'm sorry, all right? I apologise for, for my failure to be diplomatic, but this is just me. I'm talking off the top of my head, and I'm expressing what I think, right? And I'm talking without constraint. And when I'm talking without constraint, this is what happens, right? Moral realism is a fucking ridiculous position, and it is an embarrassment that 62% of philosophers accept it. I say it's an embarrassment. It's not surprising, right? In the previous survey, I think it was something like 56%. So actually, I mean, 56%, 62%, it's not a huge change. And it's not surprising to me that there was a change in favour of realism. This is what I was expecting. In fact, if anything, I was expecting it to be even worse than this. I would probably predicted, like, well, maybe not. I was going to say like 65 to 70. I probably would have predicted that. So there are several things that have happened since the last survey, or there were things that were happening around the time of the last survey that have since had time to gain more adherence. So first of all, more in the more recent meta-ethics literature, I think there have been some pretty, what a lot of people find to be quite convincing attempts to defend moral non-naturalism, or at least there have been more sophisticated attempts to defend non-naturalist positions. Obviously, there was a time when non-naturalism was seen as kind of hopeless, like it was just metaphysically weird to postulate non-natural properties, and it had problems with the epistemology, like how are we going to come to know what these non-natural properties are. But there are philosophers like Michael Huemer and David Enoch and Terence Cuneo and so on who've done a lot of work at trying to answer those problems. And, I mean, I don't find their positions convincing, but it's not surprising that a lot of people do. I mean, they're clever people. So, these more sophisticated forms of non-naturalism will have gained adherence. The other thing is that there are arguments that have been discussed in really the sort of last 10, 15 years. I mean, particularly the companions in guilt argument. So the companions in guilt argument, well, at least with respect to epistemic norms, a lot of people find that convincing. Again, I think that's a crap argument. I don't think it works. But a lot of people do think it works. So, given that there's been more recent discussion of arguments like that. And then there's also just been attempts by people like, I guess, Parfit and Scanlon to defend like minimal realism, the idea that realism doesn't really incur the sort of commitments that, or metaphysical commitments that people had assumed. Yeah, you know, like all of this, there's just this sort of convergence towards a more realist approach, or there's convergence towards approaches that are more friendly to realism. In fact, even anti-realists seem to be making so many concessions to realists that, you know, they end up kind of collapsing into realism. So this is one of the problems that arises for quasi-realists. Quasi-realists have become so successful at, you know, capturing everything that realists want. You know, quasi-realists think that they can have moral truth, moral facts, moral properties, and so on, that a lot of people think, you know, there just isn't really that much of a distinction, that actually that ends up collapsing into realism as well. So, you know, we seem to be moving in a realist direction. That explains this result, but it does not excuse it. Okay? Right then, let's move on. Do I have... Yeah, kind of surprising to see only 50% physicalists. I mean, I knew that the tide was sort of turning against physicalism a little bit, but, you know, with things like panpsychism and, I guess, pragmatist approaches and all that. But even so, you know, it sort of still feels like physicalism is the general consensus. You know, you kind of predict it to be like 70% or something, or 80%. But no, most... It's still the majority position, but only 50%. That's quite interesting. Look at this. 40% of philosophers just don't want to have £1 million. Strange, but again, not surprising. Now this was a surprise. I think this might have been the most surprising thing of all, actually. Virtue ethics here is at 37%. Now, in the previous survey, and this was only, you know, just over 10 years ago, virtue ethics was only at 18%. Deontology and consequentialism, as far as I know, I think they're about the same as they were in the previous survey. But virtue ethics has seen a huge rise in adherence. It's like... Man, I mean, virtue ethicist surge here. What an incredible gain of ground the virtue ethicists have had. And I have no idea why this would be. I mean, I'm not aware of any, you know, recent books that have like been well known as presenting a like more sophisticated, more defensible approach to virtue ethics. I mean, maybe this just could be my complete ignorance of normative ethics, right? Like maybe there has been some really important stuff in the last 10 years that I should know about. But no, I mean, I don't. I don't know why this would be. If anybody does have any thoughts on that, I'd be very interested to hear it, because that's pretty, like, it's doubled. I mean, you know, the relativists doubled, but we doubled from like, what was it, 2.5 to 5% or something. Virtue ethics way up to 37% here. Amazing. Okay. Perceptual experience. Now, I will confess something here. I don't know what the distinction is between representationalism and sense data theory. So my understanding of representationalism is that the point is, we do not directly perceive objects in the external world. Rather, the direct objects of our perception are mental representations. So when I open my eyes, I look at a table. I'm looking at a table right now. Okay, so a representationalist will say that I'm not directly perceiving the table itself, the mind-independent external object. Instead, I'm perceiving some sort of mental representation of the table. So it's a kind of indirect perception view. That's my understanding of representationalism. But I thought that was what sense data theory was. Like, so the sense data are the mental representations. Like, isn't that the idea that like, you know, I look at the table and I have but I'm not perceiving the table. I'm perceiving sense data, like, you know, colors, and maybe I can touch it and I can, like, you know, feel certain textures and so on. But those sense data represent some object in the external world. I'm not directly perceiving the external world, I'm perceiving sense data. So it seems like these are just different names for the same thing, and yet representationalism is by far the most popular of the options, sense data by far the least popular. So I can't explain that. Again, this is perhaps just me expressing my ignorance of something I should know about. This question on philosophical methods is, it's kind of an interesting one. When I suppose it's interesting to see what people have responded, but I think this is a pretty silly question. When I initially answered the survey, I did try to do this. Like I tried to, say which ones I accepted and which ones I rejected. But look, the thing is that these are different methods, and different methods are appropriate for different goals, right? Different methods are appropriate for different forms of inquiry. So it just depends on what you're trying to do, what question you're trying to answer. To ask, which is most useful / important, like conceptual analysis or empirical philosophy, right? Which of these is most important? That's like asking, hammer versus screwdriver, which is most useful / important? It depends on what you're doing with it. There obviously isn't some, it doesn't make any sense to give just a general answer to say, well, the hammer is more important. No, it depends on the job. You've got to choose the right tool for the job. And in philosophy, there are all sorts of different questions we might be asking. And, any of these methods, could be legitimate depending on the context. That's my take on this question. Interesting, but kind of silly. And now look at this. Isn't this a shocker? That in a survey of professional philosophers, right, in a survey of people who are employed to do philosophy, only 3.8% think that there's no philosophical progress. Why could that be? The only possible explanation for this result is that the arguments in favour of philosophical progress are so overwhelmingly good. It's a slam dunk case against the view that there's no philosophical progress. That's obviously why these results are the way they are. There's no other possible explanation for this. Okay. I don't have a lot of things to say about these other ones. Scientific anti-realism, I think, has ever so slightly gained a little bit of ground. I think it was 11% last time. So, that's, I don't know, it's probably not statistically significant, is it? But anyway. 35% of philosophers quite happy to use a form of transport that involves the total obliteration of their bodies and brains. They must be the same as the ones who are quite happy to just walk away with £1,000 rather than $1 million. Strange people, philosophers. Okay. Well, I don't necessarily have anything to say about every question, obviously. The abortion question was, I think, not as interesting as it could have been, because I think what they should have done is given more options. It's not remotely surprising to see that 80% of philosophers think it's permissible in the first trimester. That's not a shock at all. It would have been much more interesting, I think, to give, say, you could have maybe split it by trimester. You could have said, is it acceptable first trimester, second trimester, third trimester? Or maybe you could have said, is it acceptable first trimester? Is it acceptable up to viability? Is it acceptable up to birth? Now, it would have been very interesting to see what philosophers said about that, right? Where are philosophers tending to draw the line on this? How many philosophers think abortion is okay up to birth? How many think it's okay up to viability? That's an interesting question. So who knows? Maybe in the next survey, they'll give more options for this one. Oh, look at this. 23%, actually close to 24% of philosophers endorse justified true belief. Isn't that remarkable? Nearly a quarter still hanging on to justified true belief, account of knowledge. it's wonderful to see. I selected justified true belief. But you know, justified true belief it's where we all start when we do epistemology. That's kind of the starting point, right? And then you get hit with all the Gettier cases and so on, and you know, epistemology kind of spins out from there. So it's remarkable to see that nearly a quarter of us do not just start with justified true belief. That's where we end. I mean, for me, like, I think that I'm not like, I don't, you know, I'm not like that committed to justified true belief, but I'm inclined towards it. I think that the point of philosophy is conceptual engineering, or at least that's one of the things. That's one of the points of philosophy, right? That's one of the things that we can do when we do philosophy is, you know, natural language contains all of these concepts that play useful roles, but that are confused, messy, incoherent. And part of the point of philosophy is to precisify them. And I think that justified true belief is a good precisification of knowledge. One of the things that I would point out about Gettier cases is, first of all, there's a pretty good argument that any analysis of knowledge which treats the justification condition and the truth condition as being independent is going to face Gettier cases. This is something Zagzebski points out in The Inescapability of Gettier Problems. So, like, if you want to have an analysis of knowledge that's treating those things as separate, if you want to say that there can be false justified beliefs, and I think we should want to say that, then you're going to face Gettier problems. So actually, Gettier problems are a problem for, you know, for almost everybody, right? At least almost everybody who's trying to give an analysis of knowledge. And so with that in mind, it's like, I don't see them as providing any reason to move from the justified true belief analysis. And in any case, I think that, you know, I don't see why analyses should be sort of hostage to intuitions, or at least so strongly hostage to intuitions about all sorts of, you know, about cases that are, you know, relatively unusual or whatever, you know, like there are lots of things that we're weighing up when we're trying to give an analysis of a concept. And I think that we can say that Gettier cases are cases where somebody, you know, has knowledge but like almost didn't, or they have knowledge but they were lucky to have it, right? I think lucky knowledge is possible, and that seems to me to be what's going on in Gettier cases. The mere fact that, like, intuitively we don't seem to have knowledge in those cases, I don't think that fact alone should move us from the justified true belief analysis. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, so I'm just going to move on. But I just want to say, you know, it's nice to see 24% of people still hanging on to JTB. Yeah. I remain to be convinced that the belief or credence question is even remotely interesting. Now this is my least popular response. I said that in the previous survey, relativism was my least popular response. In this survey, it's causation, because I said causation was non-existent. I adopted that position, and that's only at 4.1%. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Look at that, 22% dualists. Who would have thought that? I mean, I suppose that makes sense given the how popular non-physicalism was about the mind. But even so, you know, you don't imagine that 22% of philosophers are dualists. Although actually, it was, what was it, like 18% accepted theism. So, you know, I don't know, maybe that tracks. This was a real surprise to me. 32% of philosophers accept the brute fact view of fine-tuning. Now, this is surprising because, in my experience, philosophers don't like postulating brute facts, right? They tend to try to avoid it. Philosophers love giving explanations. Brute facts are the last resort, right? Like that's what you do when there's just no other options. But in the case of cosmological fine-tuning, if you think that cosmological fine-tuning is a thing, and I actually don't, I selected no fine-tuning, but if you accept the claim that there is cosmological fine-tuning, I mean, we don't need to postulate brute facts here, right? We can come up with plausible explanations, like the multiverse. The multiverse is a perfectly intuitive, naturalistic explanation for cosmological fine-tuning. And maybe you don't want to actually accept it, right? Maybe you don't want to say that that's what actually happened, but then you can just, you can just be agnostic about it, right? You can just say, well, I don't know, right? I don't know what the reason for cosmological fine-tuning is, but we have on the table at least a plausible naturalistic explanation. So why the hell would you go for the brute fact view? I mean, bear in mind, right, that if you are adopting a brute fact view, you're already engaging in controversial metaphysical speculation, right? I mean, so even the claim that there are such things as brute facts, right, that is a controversial metaphysical claim, and then to identify a certain fact as a brute fact, that is certainly a controversial metaphysical claim. So if you're going to be engaging in metaphysical speculation anyway, then you might as well get something, get something for your trouble. You might as well get something out of it. You might as well give an explanation, like the multiverse explanation, that is, that sort of satisfies the mind's desire for understanding, that satisfies the mind's desire for a kind of pleasing picture of the world. Like, why would you adopt a brute fact view in this context? 32%? I mean, to me, right, this is like I'm sorry, but the brute fact view here, I feel it's a sort of loser position, It's like, you can either do what I do and go for empiricism and like resist metaphysical speculation, right, and say you're not going to go in for that. Okay, that's one option. The other option is to go in for metaphysics. But if you're going to do metaphysics, at least be ambitious about it, Like, at least give explanations. I mean, I don't see what the appeal is of accepting this position in this context. That was a surprise. That was a surprise to see so many philosophers accepting that. Interesting to see that the extended mind is doing so well, because I feel like that was a minority position only like 20 years ago. And so for it to be, now like half philosophers accepting it, that's quite interesting. So I don't have a lot to say about most of these. I mean, it's interesting to see what philosophers think, but it's a shame that only 2% of people are infinitists. It kind of makes me want to become an infinitist when I see that the position is that unpopular. But unfortunately, my beliefs don't work like that. I can't just pick them. I really wish I could just become an infinitist. Maybe I should start reading loads of infinitist literature, and I can kind of nudge myself in that direction. Because I mean, only 2%. There needs to be more people speaking up for infinitism. I mean, infinitism isn't that bad. It's certainly better than fucking reliabilism at like 34%. Jesus. So here are the other things that I don't really have many thoughts on. Okay. Oh, now this was interesting. Only 5% of people accept error theory. Only 5% of professional philosophers. Now this was surprising to me because there's two reasons. So the first reason is just when I look at the contemporary literature, it seems like a lot of the debate is kind of organised around error theory. I mean, there are prominent anti-realists who are error theorists. Richard Joyce, I guess, is one of the most prominent figures in like meta-ethics who defends anti-realism. He's an error theorist. You've got Jonas Olson, you've got Bart Strumer. And then, of course, going back a bit more, you've got Mackey and Roos and people like that. But, error theory has always... So for quite a while, error theory has been a major position in the debate, and it seems like there are lots of people writing now who are defending error theory. And when you look at the way in which people have talked about things like the companions and guilt argument, it seems to be framed in terms of of error theory. At least much of the literature seems to be framed in those terms. So one reason why this is surprising is just because, like, I just thought, on the basis of reading the literature, that there were more error theorists. Another reason why it's surprising is that there are plenty of people who have anti-realist intuitions. I mean, I know that anti-realism is not the popular position among professional philosophers, but it's still a significant minority. It was, still like a quarter. That's a lot of people. Among lay people, I think you find the same thing. I imagine that like at least a quarter of lay people are anti-realists. In fact, I would imagine it's probably more. So, there's a lot of people with anti-realist inclinations. And if you have anti-realist inclinations, it seems like error theory is the natural position. Because, error theory is the cognitivist view. And the cognitivist analysis of moral statements, well, that's just taking them at face value, right? Somebody says slavery is wrong. If you just look at that in terms of its like surface grammar, it seems to be attributing a property to an action, right? It seems analogous to a claim like grass is green, right? So cognitivism is, in that respect, it seems the most intuitive. Like it seems to be just taking moral statements at face value. And certainly, there's obviously then there are the technical philosophical arguments. There are technical problems for non-cognitivism, like the Frege-Geach problem. There's the fact that we've got a lot more work. Sort of the prospects for truth conditional semantics are often thought to be better than for like expressivist semantics, whatever, right? So there are these technical issues, but it's just intuitively I would have thought more people would be attracted to error theory. I mean, 5% in favour of error theory. Error theory is as popular as relativism about knowledge. Think about that, because I mean, how unpopular relativism about knowledge is, right? That's where error theory is. That's what. Oh my God, man! Error theorists are not doing well. I thought they were doing better than that. Okay, yeah, other minds. It's kind of funny when you first read this and you sort of see like only 95% of philosophers accepts that adult humans have other minds, but have minds. But then, of course, it's actually not surprising, is it? Because there are illusionists like Keith Frankish, there are eliminative materialists. So, of course, only 95% of philosophers accept that adult humans have minds. Or at least are conscious. That's what the question is, right? For which groups are some members conscious? I have to say, right, this is not based on anything, but it's just a brute intuition. But I'm just going to express it because why the hell not? My feeling is that consciousness is either like very, very special. So it's either restricted to, cognitively sophisticated humans, let's say, so humans who are able to, engage in conceptual thought, humans who have language, who can have thoughts about thoughts, like higher order thoughts. So, consciousness is either restricted to beings like that, or it's just everywhere. It's like even particles have some sort of consciousness, and the universe is just saturated with consciousness in the way it's saturated with mass. Like the panpsychists are right. I don't know why. I don't know why that's my view, but it is. I think consciousness is either something very, very special, or it's something that is just everywhere. So yeah, that's my intuition, and obviously that's completely epistemically worthless, but that's what it is. Oh, look at this. Again, another shocking result that the survey of professional philosophers, of people who are employed to do philosophy, only 3.6% of them think that there's no philosophical knowledge. What could possibly explain that, other than the fact that the arguments for philosophical knowledge are so overwhelmingly powerful? There just couldn't be any other explanation. A real shame to see that modal realists form only about 4.5% of philosophers. I feel like there should be more modal realists. Modal realism is sexy, okay? That's all. It just is. Modal realism is wrong, but it's sexy. I mean, moral realism isn't even sexy, but modal realism is. So there should be more modal realists. Have you read On the Plurality of Worlds? It's a wonderful book. It's totally wrong. I mean, completely wrong. But like, I kind of admire it. I feel like if you're going to go in for this sort of stuff, like I say, if you're going to do metaphysics, it was like I said with respect to the cosmological fine-tuning thing. If you're going to do metaphysics, just be ambitious about it. You just go for it, man. Like, so yeah. I mean, if you're going to believe in abstract objects and moral facts and all that bullshit, then you might as well believe in concrete possible worlds. And then you can enter the philosophical paradise that they will open up for you. Very surprised to see 35% accepting the principle of sufficient reason. That I did not expect, because, I mean, I don't know, I don't feel like most philosophers appeal to, or at least it seems like most philosophers try to avoid appealing to this kind of thing. But, you know, yeah, apparently I'm wrong about that. Right. Would be interesting to compare that to a similar poll for physicists. I actually was sent a poll of physicists, and there were differences. In the poll that was sent to me, only about 5% of physicists accepted many worlds, for instance. So, you know, again, yeah, just interesting to think about the differences there. Yeah. Okay, yeah, response to external world skepticism. So, interesting, I think, that only 10%, or closer to 11%, I suppose, accepted contextualism. Because if you recall the question about knowledge, most respondents were contextualists. At least I think, what was it? Something like, I can't remember actually. Was it like 40% or something, or 50% even? I don't remember. Well, whatever it was, I feel like there were a lot of contextualists with respect to knowledge claims, and of course, contextualism historically has been applied in response to external world skepticism. But it seems here it's actually not a very popular move. I don't think contextualism works as a response to external world skepticism. I have a video on that, but it is, you know, that is how it has been applied. And I think that most people, when they encounter contextualism, they probably encounter it for the first time in the context of the response to external world skepticism. At least that was the case for me when I was learning epistemology. So it is interesting to see that contextualism is so popular, and yet so few people are sort of inclined to use it as a response to the skeptic. Actually, even the abductive response, although it's one of the more popular responses here, I would have thought that would be more popular. Inference to the best explanation and abduction, you know, that's in vogue at the moment. And it does have an obvious application as a response to skepticism. Again, I don't think it works. Personally, I suppose, more inclined to a sort of pragmatic response. But yeah, I would have thought that the abductive and contextualist responses would be more popular. I feel like whenever, you know, when I've read sort of introductions to skepticism and stuff, they always seem to be the sort of, you know, those kinds of moves always seem to be among the more popular ones. Anyway, yeah, well, kind of coming to the end now. Do I have anything more to say? Well, it is nice to see that dialetheism is on 12%. I mean, it's still a minority position, but who would have thought of that? 40 years ago, 50 years ago, who would have predicted that in 2021, 12% of professional philosophers accept that there are true contradictions? Isn't that wonderful? I mean, Graham Priest has really done a good job there. Yeah, well, I mean, that's all I have to say about that. That's my reaction. There you go. That's the react video to the PhilPapers survey. I mean, the whole thing is fascinating to see what philosophers think, but those were my comments for the views that I had comments on. So there you go. That's all. Goodbye.